have just learned more than 1 million people who live in this country don't speak the language.
Is that all?
Well, exactly. That sounded low.
To be a severe underestimate.
I think so as well. I'm quite sure, actually, and I'm sure people who only speak a little bit, So that's an issue. Then I think it was Robert Jenrick shared this new law around pre-sentencing. Did you see that? Around that people from minorities and transgender people will be sort of given extra consideration before being sentenced. What the hell is going on?
Well, what is going on is that we are reaping the whirlwind. We are reaping the whirlwind of uncontrolled immigration. We're also reaping a whirlwind which is to which we are peculiarly vulnerable. Everybody says, or it used to be fashionable to say, that Britain coped with multiculturalism unusually well, and coped with immigration unusually well. And there is a reason, and I would say to a significant extent, it's true that we did. Because remember, what is peculiar, did you notice when we were having this conversation earlier, I was talking about England.
Yes.
I wasn't, as it were, confusing. I wasn't making the mistake of saying England when I really mean Britain and including Scotland. I was deliberately talking about England. Because what we've got to remember is there isn't a British nation.
It's very confusing. I've never quite understood it.
Well, for a simple reason. We are called the United Kingdom of Great Britain for a very good reason. We are a fusion of two completely separate monarchies. We're a fusion of Scotland and England. With the Act of Union of 1707. And what is really important to remember, with that Act of Union in 1707, the English, this is not the sort of usual rant of Scottish nationalists, the English didn't conquer Scotland. Scotland wasn't anglicised. There was no attempt at anglicising Scotland. On the contrary, the Act of Union specifically preserves to Scotland every lineament of separate nationhood that you can think of. Scotland has got its own legal system. It's got its own religion to the, in a way, its own variation of Christianity, Calvinist Presbyterianism, the Church of Scotland. And it has its own religion to the extent that the monarch changes religion as they cross the border.
Oh, wow.
Which is why Princess Anne was able to get herself married at Crathay Church at a time when the Church of Scotland allowed second marriage and the Church, after divorce, and the Church of England didn't. Hence Prince Charles's awkward problem, in having to have a registry office wedding when he married the present Queen. Scotland, more than that, an entirely separate educational system, its own universities, its own right to issue currency, its own peerage, its own titles of honour, its own system of heraldry. The only thing that was united was the Crown, which was already united, and Parliament. They were the only two things that were united. So in other words, with union, you were sort of British abroad. So we talked about the British Empire, because remember, the reason that the Scots came into union with England was, in fact, they had failed to set up their own empire. They'd tried to set up an empire in the Isthmus of Panama, the Darien scheme, and it had failed catastrophically. So Scotland was bankrupt in 1707, which is the principal reason it agrees to union with England. And what they do is they bargain away their freedom in return for access to the British Empire. But at home, you're English and you're Scots. So I'm completely uninterested in sport and especially uninterested in football. But the first football, and I'm talking about soccer, the first football internationals are between England and Scotland. It's why there's no British team.
Because of that delineation.
Because of that delineation. And of course, you incorporate Wales and Ireland. They were already, in one way or another, incorporated with England, or Ireland goes in and out of being a separate pseudo-kingdom. Mm-hmm. And what happens from union onwards, the Crown deliberately, and latterly the politicians, deliberately pander to the idea of 4 separate nations. So you start giving royal princes an English title, a Scottish title, then you add an Irish title and a Welsh title. You start deliberately from the 19th century onward. Well, from the 18th century, Ireland's already got its capital in Dublin, which was, before the Irish got their hands on it, a grand and magnificent Georgian city. You develop Edinburgh as the wonderful, elegant city of the 18th century, but then you deliberately create a capital in Wales. And this is Lloyd George at the beginning of the 20th century. Cardiff was just a coal quay. That was its only, that was its purpose. And it suddenly turned into a grand Edwardian capital. Unfortunately, the First World War comes and they never quite finished building it. But magnificent, grand Edwardian Potsdam Classical Centre. So you've got this strangest of things, the most powerful country in the world not actually being a nation state. And our identity was this extraordinarily complex thing. Remember, we didn't have a thing called citizenship. Your, as it were, the definition of what you were a subject of the crown. And the most powerful source of identity in Britain was the monarchy. This is true right up to the Second World War. And I have the plaque that was given to my father's family after his eldest brother, after Abraham, was one of those. He was actually sent to Gallipoli and he died of his wounds, and he's buried at Alexandria. And the plaque is for the fallen. So it shows the Britannia mourning with the lion. It's a magnificent thing in heavy bronze, and it's inscribed "For King and Country." You fought for the king. And as late as the Second World War, you see George VI profoundly concerned that Churchill was replacing him as the war leader. And what happened, particularly under New Labour, partly with the breakup of empire, partly with the desire to create a clear notion of British, because of course that idea of being a subject of the crown you shared to begin with every inhabitant of the empire, who were all subjects of the crown.
And then what were you? Was there not nationality? Would you say I'm English, I'm Scottish? Is that?
Well, but again, nation, yes, you would have said English or Scots. And the idea, the only time I remember as a boy that you used the word, nobody ever called people Brits.
Even Americans?
Well, of course Americans did, and of course Irish did. Fenians called. Those opposed to. It was an outsider's term for us. We just called ourselves we.
So is what you're saying that movement towards calling oneself British, calling ourselves British, open up the doors?
Is a new development. Many things go towards it. It's a result of immigration. It's a result of the dissolution of the empire. It's a result of the marginalization of the crown from public life. The thing that most strikes me is how the monarchy has shrunk.
Yeah.
The monarchy was the centre. We didn't have, again, why did we avoid in Britain? Why did we avoid the violent horrors of communism and fascism and whatever? Those tidal waves of blood and soil nationalism that tore Europe apart? The answer is because our sense of identity was a much subtler one. It was primarily tied up with the crown. And that's a quite harmless thing when you come to think of it. Why is our national anthem isn't about England? God save the king. You see what I mean?
Well, yeah.
And all of that has been shoved aside, particularly under New Labour, particularly by Gordon Brown. And you've tried to create this lame-back, limping thing called Britishness. You've even eroded our historical tradition, of course. Devolution broke the essential bond between England and Scotland. If you wanted a model of government that was bound to fail, it's devolution. Couldn't we have just looked at the fate of Stormont before we decided to reproduce it?
Gosh.
if you think about it, if you decided to reproduce it in Edinburgh and Cardiff. And all the evidence of it in Edinburgh and Cardiff is that it's been not as violently catastrophic as in Northern Ireland, but in every other way. The Scotland of sturgeon or salmon, or the Wales of Drakeford have been as absolutely as disastrous in terms of administration as Stormont ever was.
So,
but you see, what I'm trying to say is that because we had this absence of a passionate single sense of nationhood. And can we just continue this? Because I don't think people understand it enough. You see, if you look in Germany, if you look in Italy, if you look particularly in France and America, you use things like, America, how did you forge Americanness out of this extraordinary cocktail of people? You above all used mass education. You use compulsory education, which is why Americans are forever saluting flags and praying. Well, they don't pray prayers in school, but all of those kind of rituals. We have no single system of education in this country. The way in which you enforced nationhood was above all through a program of public education. We are older than that. So in England, you have state schools, you've Church of England schools, you've Catholic schools, you've Quaker schools, you've Jewish schools, you've now got Islamic schools, you've got county schools, you've got public schools, which are, of course, private. You see what I mean? It's completely... Compare that with France. It's a completely different structure. We've not had that kind of process of radical national simplification, which took when we tried to forge a nation, which is exactly what happened in France. So, in other words, the last time we went through anything like what France went through in the 19th century, or what the Ukraine is going through now, is the reign of Henry VIII. It's 500 years ago.